There is a street tucked quietly between two hills, where the sunlight always seems to arrive a little softer, a little slower. It is not marked on any notable map. Delivery drivers often miss it. Tourists never find it. But those who live nearby speak of it the way one might speak of a recurring dream, familiar, indistinct, and oddly persuasive. They call it by its official name, of course, Rosewood Lane, but more often simply the Loop. Not because of any literal curve in the road, but because no matter where you started, you always seem to return with something of the past clinging to you, like perfume that won't wash off. The houses lining the street are not grand, but they are proud in their own quiet way. Painted in soft pastels, now faded by the years, they lean slightly, as if bowing under the weight of memory. Each one has a porch swing that still creaks even when no one is near, and a garden where flowers bloom stubbornly out of season. The air carries scents that seem misplaced. Lavender in winter, chimney smoke in summer, the smell of rain long before the clouds gather. There's always a sense that something just happened here, something small and significant, though no one can say exactly what. Newcomers rarely last long. They move in with excitement, unpacking boxes filled with modern life, only to find themselves growing more nostalgic with each passing day. Calendars remain unmarked, clocks go unwound. The days begin to blend, softly, like old film reels overlapping, and those who stay, those who grow accustomed to the loop, begin to walk with a certain rhythm, as if keeping pace with something invisible. They stop checking the date. They keep letters they never meant to keep. They pause at intersections, not because of traffic, but because something inside them hesitates. On Rosewood Lane, it's not uncommon to hear an old melody through an open window, not from a speaker, but from a piano no one recalls being moved in. A child's laughter may echo down the sidewalk, even though the youngest resident is well into his 70s, and sometimes a breeze will carry with it the distinct murmur of a name you haven't spoken in decades. People turn their heads instinctively, scanning the hedges, the porches, the benches, as if expecting someone they love to be sitting there again just for a moment. No one talks about it directly. No one says, "This street holds the past like a sponge holds water." But it's understood. There is a subtle agreement among those who remain, to let the loop be, to let yesterday visit without interruption, to allow the familiar crack of the screen door, the flicker of the same dream, the presence of absence, and the soft hum of memory to pass through as if they belonged here, because perhaps they do. People who visit, the rare friend, the reluctant relative, often comment on how peaceful it feels. They say it like a compliment, unaware that what they feel is not peace but stillness. The kind of stillness found in a house where no one has lived for years, but everything remains in place. The photograph slightly tilted on the mantel, the coat draped over the chair, the coffee cup on the windowsill still bearing the ghost of a lip. On Rosewood Lane, that feeling is not confined to one home, but stretches across the entire street, like a breath no one quite finished exhaling. The mailboxes here tell a quiet story. Many contain envelopes with handwriting now extinct, loops and flourishes that suggest a slower time. Some hold yellowing postcards, still legible, addressed to people who may no longer live, or may never have lived, at those addresses. And yet, no one throws them out. They remain, as if waiting for the right moment to be read again. Even the mail carrier, who claims to hate superstition, delivers with the reverence of someone placing flowers on a grave. There is a woman, always a woman, seen most often near number 14. She waters plants that bloom no matter the season. She sits on the porch steps and hums lullabies that no one recognizes, but everyone remembers. Her hair is the color of iron in fading light. No one knows when she moved in, or if she ever moved in. Some say she was always there, like the lilac bush in front of her house that never loses its color. She does not speak, but people wave to her, and she always returns the gesture, as if acknowledging a memory they forgot they shared. Children do not live here anymore. They visit sometimes. They run with the awkward excitement of youth, but their shouts and laughter seem to hit an invisible ceiling. There's something about the street that mutes noise, not with force, but with gentleness, as if inviting quiet rather than demanding it. Even dogs fall silent here, tails wagging slower, noses lifted higher, sniffing the way someone might skim through a diary they were never supposed to read. Some homes remain completely untouched, curtains drawn, lights never flickering on, but if you pass them at the right moment, dusk usually, you might glimpse a silhouette standing just beyond the frame. Not frightening, just there. Like an old friend waiting for you to remember the story you never finished telling. And as you walk by, you may find yourself slowing down, your feet unsure whether to move forward or turn around. On this street, every step forward seems to carry the weight of all the steps that came before it. It was said, quietly and without explanation, that mirrors behaved strangely on Rosewood Lane. Not in the way of horror stories, no sudden movements, no reflections that moved independently, but in subtler, more unnerving ways. Some residents reported seeing themselves dressed in clothes they hadn't owned in years. Others claimed their reflections moved slower, or not at all. The glass, polished or dusty, never quite told the truth of the present. Instead, it offered versions of the past, like old portraits reappearing without being hung. Most learned to avoid them altogether, or else covered them with linen, the way one might hush a room that remembered too much. Time here didn't stop. It simply lost interest in moving forward. Clocks still ticked, calendars still hung on the walls, but the passage of time became something less reliable, more suggestive than factual. A loaf of bread bought on Monday would still be soft on Friday. Flowers left in a vase wouldn't wilt for weeks. Letters dated last year might arrive tomorrow, postmarked from a town that no longer had a post office. And birthdays, when celebrated, had the curious tendency of recalling the wrong age, the wrong decade, the wrong version of someone altogether. Visitors often asked about the trees. They seemed too tall for the space, their roots lifting the sidewalks gently like a shrug. Their leaves fell in no particular season. In autumn they blushed red and gold, but in spring they sometimes did the same, as if their rhythm had been rewound and looped into a different order. One tree in particular, an old sycamore near the center of the lane, was rumored to whisper names when the wind was right. No one had ever proven it, but many had stood beneath its branches, certain they'd heard someone they missed say their name back. Even the rain here didn't behave as it should. It didn't fall. It returned. Pooled memories from old gutters, familiar puddles that rippled with recognition. The sound it made against the roof was more like tapping fingers than drops, more like someone remembering than something falling. On rainy days, people tended to stay inside, not because they feared getting wet, but because the rain made them feel too much. Nostalgia, usually so distant and hazy, pressed close like steam on a window, drawing outlines of days long finished. And sometimes they cried, not from sadness but from the strange comfort of remembering. And then there were the photographs. Every home had them, on mantels and frames, tucked behind magnets on refrigerators. But the odd thing was, they changed, slowly, subtly. A figure once blurred might come into focus. A child once absent from a birthday photo might appear near the edge, hand outstretched toward cake. A smile once tight with tension might soften. The photos didn't lie. They evolved. Or perhaps they corrected themselves. As if the street, unwilling to let time move forward, busied itself with editing what had already happened. There was one bench on Rosewood Lane that never collected dust. It sat beneath the crooked lamplight between houses number 7 and 9, neither too central nor too hidden. It wasn't particularly comfortable, its paint chipped and its iron legs slightly uneven, but it always looked as if someone had just left it, only moments ago. People sat there without realizing why. Not to rest, not to wait, but to remember. And when they did, their eyes often glazed over, not from fatigue, but from the sensation of seeing something they hadn't seen in years. A boy waving from the far end of a street, a bicycle with a bent wheel, the soft trailing edge of a dress disappearing behind a hedge. The bench held more than bodies. It held echoes. If you sat long enough, you might hear the soft brushing of newspaper pages, the clink of a spoon stirring sugar into tea, the crackle of old vinyl turning just before the music begins. Once a man stood beside it for 3 hours, holding a coat he claimed wasn't his. Another time, a woman whispered a lullaby in Hungarian and burst into tears, even though she swore she didn't speak the language. The bench didn't cause madness, only memory, and sometimes remembering too deeply made the present dissolve a little. Behind the bench stood a hedge that bloomed white, no matter the season. Even in frost, its blossoms persisted, like something untouched by time. People called it the snow bush, though no one had planted it. It was always just there, part of the landscape like the lamppost and the uneven sidewalk crack where water always gathered. Some believed the bush had grown from something buried, not a seed, but a sentiment. It seemed to exhale a kind of fragrance that couldn't be bottled. Warm linen, lemon pie, the scent of hands once held. And in its presence even the most cynical visitors paused. Children, when they passed the bench, often stopped talking, their games forgotten, their shouts swallowed. One boy once asked his mother, "Why is that place sad and happy at the same time?" She didn't answer. There wasn't one. Because that's what Rosewood Lane did. It held contradictions gently, like a teacup with 2 handles. Joy with grief, longing with comfort, presence with absence. And on that particular bench, all of it gathered, resting quietly beside whoever dared to sit and stay long enough to feel it. The bench had no plaque, no name carved into the wood, and yet those who lived there spoke of it as if it belonged to someone, not in ownership, but in memory. She used to sit there, they might say. He always paused there, just before the sun dipped. No one knew exactly who she or he was, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the knowing, the collective, silent agreement that the bench was more than wood and paint. It was a resting place for what had once been real and still wasn't quite ready to leave. Further down the street, past the corner where ivy clung to the telephone pole like it was afraid of letting go, stood the only house no one entered. Not because it was abandoned. The lights still flickered at dusk, and the curtains moved just enough to suggest life within, but because no one could remember ever being invited. The grass remained trimmed, the porch swept. Sometimes a record could be heard spinning faintly through the window, usually something with strings and silence in equal measure, and yet there was no name on the mailbox, no packages on the steps, just a welcome mat that read, "Not yet." Those who lived nearby spoke of the house with careful language, as if describing a person who might overhear. It was simply called the waiting house. Some believed it belonged to someone who hadn't arrived yet. Others said it belonged to everyone, for a time, depending on what they had lost. No one ever knocked, and no one questioned why, in the fall, its tree shed leaves that always landed in the same pattern, a spiral that never unraveled. There were rumors, of course, that inside each room looked like a different decade, that the wallpaper changed depending on who walked past, that in the attic hung coats not yet worn beside photographs not yet taken. One woman swore she saw herself through the window, older, seated at a table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't yet brewed. A child once claimed the chimney whispered bedtime stories, and while no one confirmed any of it, no one laughed either. Stranger still was how the house affected time for those who lingered nearby. A man once stood on the sidewalk outside and forgot what year he was born. Another lost his sense of direction, even though he could see his house just 2 doors down. And a mail carrier, the same one who delivered with reverence, once paused at its gate, turned around, and walked back to the start of the street without dropping off the letter in his hand. He wouldn't say why, just that it didn't feel like it needed delivering. The house never decayed. Its paint never peeled, its windows never cracked. Even the rain, so tenderly unreliable on this street, seemed to fall differently there, softer, as though unwilling to disturb whatever was inside. And perhaps that was the point. The house didn't hide a secret, it simply held space for one. A possibility not yet lived, a memory not yet made. It stood there like a comma at the end of a sentence, patient and unresolved. It's hard to say whether the house was waiting for someone to come home or for someone to leave. Every street has a sound it carries when the world goes quiet. On Rosewood Lane, it was the turning of pages. Not loud, not constant, just a soft flutter, like someone deep in thought flipping through an old book where each line meant something once, and maybe still did. It seemed to rise from nowhere and settle everywhere, in the rustling trees, in the shifting curtains, even in the footsteps of those who walked as if they had somewhere to go, only to realize the destination had long been folded back into the past. At night, the street did not sleep. It simply dimmed. Porch lights flickered on without being switched, as if sensing someone might come by. Windows glowed faintly, casting silhouettes of still lives. A hand resting on a table, a shadow stooped in thought, a rocking chair in gentle motion. The moon, when it hung above the lane, looked slightly fuller than it should have. Like it, too, had remembered something it wished it hadn't forgotten. Some residents claimed to dream more vividly after moving here, not of fantastical places or impossible events, but of moments, small ones. A bowl of soup shared in silence, a phone call made too late, a hallway once paced 1,000 times before goodbye. These weren't dreams in the traditional sense. They were reruns, glimpses, honest things that memory had tried to store away neatly, now rising to the surface again in the dark, as if to say, you left something behind. And perhaps they had. Perhaps that was what drew people here. Not the charm, not the quiet, but the quiet insistence that not everything had passed. That some parts of us, the unspoken, the unresolved, lingered in the spaces between houses, between seasons, between years. Rosewood Lane didn't haunt. It reminded. It whispered rather than called, and always in a voice that sounded eerily like your own. In the early hours before sunrise, the street would often feel warmer than it should, not with heat, but with presence, as though the very air had thickened with all the remembering. Doors remained closed, but lights would blink softly in rhythm. And if you listened carefully, not with your ears, but with whatever part of you aches when missing someone, you might hear it again, the fluttering of a page, the turning of something invisible, the looping of a moment you thought was lost. And so, the street went on. Not forward, not backward, but around. Each curve folding into another, each corner gently circling home. Not the home you lived in, the home you once felt and forgot. And Rosewood Lane, with all its unspoken grace, waited patiently for you to remember again. There was a man who moved into number 12 in early spring, though no one could quite recall which spring it was. His name, according to the mailbox, was Bernard Hale, but people rarely used it. Most referred to him as the Quiet One, not because he didn't speak, but because when he did, it felt like remembering a silence rather than breaking one. He arrived with only a few possessions, a heavy coat, a battered suitcase, and a clock that never ticked. On the first evening, he swept the porch twice, even though no leaves had fallen. Bernard did not decorate his home. No flower pots, no wind chimes, no seasonal wreaths. The curtains stayed half-drawn, revealing just enough to hint at a life inside, but not enough to confirm it. Each morning, he would step out onto the porch with a cup of something warm, tea perhaps, and stare down the lane as if expecting it to change. And though he never looked lost, he often looked like someone who had finally found the place he'd been avoiding his entire life. The neighbors accepted him in the way Rosewood Lane accepted all who stayed, with quiet observation, with unspoken rules. No one asked questions. No one offered welcome pies. But small gestures emerged over time. A book left on his step, a candle placed on his sill, a folded scarf appearing beside his mailbox on the first cold morning. Bernard acknowledged these kindnesses with a nod, sometimes a touch of his hat, but never with words. He seemed to understand that words were not the currency of this place. Over the weeks he began walking, not for exercise, not for errands, just walking. Up and down the lane, past the ivy pole, the whispering sycamore, the snowbush bench. He walked with his hands behind his back and his head tilted slightly, as if measuring something invisible. He would pause at the same spots, in front of the empty house, beneath the lamplight, beside the hedge that hummed. And then he would resume, never hurrying, never tired. It was during these walks that the street began to respond to him. a music box tune drifting from an attic, a scent of tobacco that hadn't been smoked in decades, a glimmer of reflection in a window that did not face the sun. Bernard noticed, but did not react. He walked as though he had seen it all before, as if each flicker of the uncanny was less a surprise and more a confirmation. Something long overdue, something the rest of us were only beginning to understand. And then, one morning, Bernard turned left at the bench and didn't return. Not that day, not the next. But his cup remained on the porch railing, still warm. His coat hung by the door, dry from untouched rain. And the clock inside his house, the one that had never ticked, now clicked forward, slow and steady, 1 second at a time. On the third day of his absence, someone noticed the porch light at number 12 flickering at regular intervals. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. It didn't feel like a malfunction. It felt deliberate, like a message not in language, but in pattern, a rhythm meant to be remembered. Neighbors passed by and paused, not speaking to one another, but standing just long enough to acknowledge the strangeness. One woman crossed the street slowly, stood at the base of the steps, and whispered something under her breath before walking away with tears in her eyes. No one asked her what she said. The mail kept arriving. Envelopes with old postmarks, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper with handwriting that looked suspiciously like Bernard's. But no one opened them. They were left neatly stacked in a basket beside the door, untouched, yet never collecting dust. It was as if the house refused to age in his absence. The flowers in the side yard remained in bloom even during the sudden chill that settled across the lane for a week. A cold that didn't spread to the other houses, only his. Children began to avoid the sidewalk in front of number 12, veering instead into the grass, even if it meant muddy shoes. One child, when asked why, simply said, "It feels like thinking too hard." And that explanation, vague and strange as it was, made perfect sense to those who lived there. Because that's how it felt to look at the windows now, like they were remembering something on your behalf, like they held a version of you you weren't quite ready to face. On the 7th day, the clock stopped again, just after midnight. Some said they heard it from the street, a final tick that rang louder than it should have. Others claimed they saw Bernard, briefly, sitting in the chair by the window, staring out into the fog with a content expression, like a man who had finally finished the page he'd been rereading for years. But when anyone approached, the house remained empty, still, and the porch light returned to its steady glow, unblinking. That night, the dreams on Rosewood Lane changed. They became longer, more precise. People dreamt not of broad memories, but of specific days. The last time they held someone's hand, the moment a door closed and stayed closed, the shape of a jacket hanging in the hallway long after its owner had left. The dreams didn't frighten them, but they left a heaviness behind, like something meaningful had passed through. And though it didn't stay, it rearranged the furniture slightly. And in the morning, a single chair appeared on Bernard's porch. Not his old one, a different one. Worn, but facing outward, as if waiting for someone else. Weeks passed, though time, as always on Rosewood Lane, was reluctant to make itself known. Seasons suggested themselves without certainty. A neighbor remarked that the leaves were turning early this year, but another swore they had already turned weeks ago. The air carried the scent of both cinnamon and lilac, neither in bloom nor in season, and Bernard's chair remained empty. Not abandoned, just between uses. It was around this time that the street began to feel slightly out of sync, like a record playing half a beat slower. People misremembered the days. Someone brought trash bins out on the wrong morning, only to find the entire street had done the same. A man greeted a woman as if seeing her for the first time. She was his sister. Someone else watered a garden that hadn't grown in years, smiling at invisible daisies. It was as if a fog had settled, not in the air, but in memory itself, softening the edges of routine. More visitors began walking through the lane, not strangers, but people who hadn't been seen in years. Some were cousins returning from cities they'd left long ago. Some were former tenants, drawn back without clear reason. A few had no explanation at all, only the sensation that something unfinished needed tending. They walked with slow steps, eyes catching on old window frames, on porch steps that looked exactly as they'd left them, though repainted many times since. Each seemed to be chasing the outline of a thought that had gone quiet. Inside number 12, shadows moved differently now. Not ominous, but observant. They shifted along the walls as if measuring how long a space could hold memory before it overflowed. Someone once claimed they saw Bernard's coat slip slightly from its hook, as if nudged. Another said the radio turned on by itself, always playing the same song, an instrumental piece with no name, just strings and a few piano notes that repeated like a lullaby refusing to resolve. No one dared take the chair from the porch, though some were tempted. A few stood beside it for minutes at a time, resting their hands on its armrest, feeling warmth where none should remain. And each time they walked away slowly, as if carrying something they hadn't arrived with. A phrase half recalled, a scent that led to tears, a name they hadn't spoken since childhood. The chair didn't give answers. It only offered the invitation to remember, deeply, painfully, tenderly. And the street, ever watchful, adjusted its rhythm once more, folding Bernard's absence into its fabric not as a loss, but as a presence newly arranged. There was one morning when fog rolled in before dawn and refused to leave. It wasn't thick nor menacing, just persistent. It curled around the chimneys, seeped under doors, and made the trees look like half-finished sketches. People moved slower that day, as though walking through old thoughts made tangible. Conversations were brief, footsteps muffled. It was the kind of day when the air itself seemed to be listening. That was the morning a letter appeared on every doorstep. Same envelope, same paper, no stamp, no return address, just a single line on the front written in delicate script. You've been here before. Most residents didn't open them. They didn't need to. The message was clear, even if it wasn't understood. A few kept theirs, tucked inside books or placed gently in drawers. Some burned them, only to find the ashes rearranged into the same words the next day on their kitchen tables. One man, a schoolteacher who prided himself on skepticism, tore his into pieces and buried them under a garden bed. The flowers there bloomed the brightest that spring, and they never wilted. After that, no one received mail for a week, not even the usual catalogs or mistaken deliveries. The mailboxes stood empty, their little red flags pointing down like weary arms. And when the letters returned, they came in handwriting that was oddly familiar, not in style, but in memory. A woman gasped when she saw her deceased father's slanted script. Another wept as she read a note in her own childhood hand, a sentence she remembered writing but never sending. None of the letters said anything profound. Some asked questions. Do you still hum that tune? Others made quiet declarations. I waited until you turned the corner. But none were dated, and none referred to anything that could be proven. They were not records. They were reminders. Not from someone else, but from the self, the one that lived here before, forgetting how to return. After this, the fog lifted. Not suddenly, but politely, as though it had completed its task. And when the sun came back, it touched the rooftops with such warmth that people stepped outside just to feel it on their faces. Yet even as light returned, something had shifted. Rosewood Lane was no longer just a street. It had become a letter itself, written in memory, folded in silence, and sent only to those willing to read between the lines. Sometime in late autumn, or perhaps early spring, depending on whom you asked, the street began to hum. Not loudly, just a faint vibration beneath the soles of your shoes, like the distant murmur of voices in another room. Some blamed it on underground pipes. Others said it was the roots of the trees growing restless. But most knew better. It was the sound of memory rearranging itself, the past warming its limbs after too long a sleep. The hum was clearest near the bench beneath the crooked lamp. People began gathering there more frequently, sitting not to rest, but to recall. Not aloud, never aloud, but inwardly, together. Sometimes they nodded, as if confirming a shared detail. Sometimes they wept quietly without knowing why, and sometimes they smiled, not in joy, but in recognition. A warmth passed among them, not physical, but collective, like a forgotten song finding its harmony again. One night, a boy stood in the center of the street barefoot, holding a candle. He said nothing. He just stood, the flame trembling but never dying. One by one, porch lights flicked off, then street lamps, then windows, until only the candle remained. One small light, steady against the weight of everything unspoken. No one knew who he was, no one claimed him, but when the lights returned, so did the memory of someone long gone, different for each person, yet uncannily specific. A brother, a neighbor, a first love. The boy's presence had opened something, not new, but buried. The street never spoke of it again, but the candle appeared on that same corner each week afterward, relit without matches, always just before nightfall. No one touched it. No one questioned it. And yet, everyone watched. Because sometimes all a memory needs to return is permission and a flame. Then came the season with no name, a span of days that didn't align with any calendar. Not cold, not warm, not early nor late. A stretch of time that felt like the pause between inhaling and exhaling. That's when the doors started to open, slowly, gently, one by one. Doors that hadn't moved in years. Doors to sheds, to cellars, to forgotten attics. None were forced. None creaked. They simply stood ajar, as if waiting for someone brave enough to look. And those who did found not ghosts, but familiarity. An old shoe with laces tied in a bow no child today would use. A coat still faintly smelling of lavender soap. A drawer full of lists with checkboxes half ticked. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet proof that life had passed here. Deeply, honestly. The kind of evidence that makes you sit down without realizing you need to. In one attic, a woman found a box of photographs, all blank. But when she held them to her chest, warmth bloomed through the paper. When she returned to them the next day, the images had developed, not of people, but of feelings, the weight of a goodbye, the hush of a room before someone cries, the echo of laughter in a hallway where no one stands anymore. On Rosewood Lane, nothing was ever lost, only delayed, only looped. And now, with the doors ajar and the fog of forgetting gently lifting, the street seemed to sigh, not from exhaustion, but from the relief of being remembered again. And so, the season with no name continued, no end, no crescendo, just the soft, persistent invitation to return to the places you thought you'd left behind. There was a window on Rosewood Lane, second floor, corner house, with panes so clean they seemed to invite the past in like a guest. No one remembered who lived there anymore. The mailbox had long since rusted shut, and the garden below had become a soft tangle of green, humming with bees that never stung. But the window remained open, just slightly, as though the room behind it needed to breathe. And on certain afternoons, if you stood on the sidewalk below and tilted your head just so, you might hear a typewriter. Not the clatter of modern keys, but the deliberate rhythm of thoughts becoming words. Tap, 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 pause, tap. Like someone writing not to be read, but to remember. No one ever saw the machine. No one ever found a ribbon or a sheet of paper. And yet the sound was always there when the sun reached the railing just so. Warm, slanting, golden. It didn't matter if it was a Monday or a decade since the last visitor passed by. The story was still being written. Some residents came to believe that the window was writing them, that their daily walks, their habitual glances, their moments of hesitation were being transcribed, preserved somewhere just beyond reach. The thought wasn't frightening. In fact, it offered a peculiar comfort, that someone, something, was paying attention to the moments that otherwise slipped through. The way a hand lingers on a banister, the pause before a name is spoken, the sigh that never becomes a sentence. And then, one day, the sound changed. The tapping slowed, stopped, started again. But different now, not less frequent, just less sure. As though the story had hit a section where memory and imagination blurred, where the truth began to fold inward. And in that pause, the street itself shifted slightly, Trees leaned a little closer to windows, shadows deepened under eaves, and the breeze carried whispers that felt like unfinished thoughts, like ellipses left hanging at the end of an old letter. People began glancing up at the window more often, not expecting to see anyone, but hoping, maybe, to be seen, to know they were still part of whatever was being remembered. One girl left a stack of blank paper on the doorstep below. A boy, barely tall enough to reach the latch, left an unopened bottle of ink. Neither explained why. They just smiled at one another and walked away. And for the first time in years, a curtain moved behind the glass. A soft wave, a subtle reply. The tapping did not return that evening, nor the next. But the feeling remained that someone, somewhere, had turned a page, and that perhaps, finally, it was time to begin a new chapter. Further down the lane, beside the house where ivy grew in perfect silence, someone placed a mirror outside. Not a large one, just a hand mirror, its handle chipped and its glass slightly fogged around the edges. It leaned against the trunk of a tree, angled upward toward the sky. No note, no frame, just reflection. People passed it for days without mention until one morning a woman bent to pick it up. She looked into it briefly, then sat down on the grass and wept. The mirror did not show anything unusual. It held no ghostly faces, no shifting images. But those who gazed into it swore they saw not themselves, but the version of who they were at their most honest. The self that smiled without caution, the one that sang in the kitchen, the one that forgave more easily. And for some, that glimpse was too much. They left quickly. For others, it became a ritual, a silent moment each morning, kneeling briefly to remember who they used to be before the years blurred the edges. Soon, more mirrors began to appear, small ones, cracked ones, a pocket mirror tied to the fence post with string, a fogged bathroom mirror nailed to the back of a tool shed door. None of them reflected the present exactly. They shimmered, always slightly delayed, as if time itself was hesitating. And it became clear to the residents, the mirrors weren't looking back at them. They were looking back for them. No one claimed ownership. No one questioned their arrival. That's how things worked on Rosewood Lane. Questions weren't asked. They were felt. And when answers came, they were never in the form of facts, only feelings. A nudge toward something once known. A tightening in the chest that said, "You've seen this before, haven't you?" One boy taped his mirror shut with cloth, saying he didn't want to remember anymore. His mother, instead of scolding him, kissed the wrapped glass and placed it beside his bed. "When you're ready," she whispered, not to him, but to the memory inside. There was a day when no wind blew, and yet the wind chimes rang, not just once, but again and again, in cascading tones that echoed too long to be natural. People emerged from their porches, half smiling, half holding their breath. The chimes weren't discordant. They were in tune, impossibly so, like a melody that each person knew but couldn't name. And beneath that sound came another, the soft clatter of typewriter keys, drifting once again from the second-floor window. It had returned, but the rhythm was new now, not hesitant, not rushed, intentional, as if the one writing had finally chosen what to say, and the street was listening. The trees leaned in, the porch swings stilled. The air grew warmer in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and across Rosewood Lane, the people stood still, not in confusion, not in fear, but in recognition. What followed was not an event, not in the way newspapers would define it, but it was felt. That evening, every light turned on at the same moment, not blinding, not dramatic, just a soft glow, house by house, lamp by lamp, window by window. Even the empty homes flickered to life, like a choir humming its first note. No voice called out. No door creaked open. And yet, the street felt complete, like a story that had been waiting for its final line. In one home, a child placed a toy on a shelf and said quietly, "He'll want this when he returns." No one asked who. No one had to. Because on Rosewood Lane, the people understood that return didn't always mean arrival. Sometimes it just meant remembrance. And sometimes that was enough. As the week unfolded, People began doing odd, tender things. A man polished his childhood bicycle and leaned it against the tree where he first fell. A woman baked a pie from a recipe she hadn't used in 40 years, even though she no longer liked the taste. A pair of twins planted forget-me-nots in the exact square of lawn where their dog used to wait for the school bus. These were not acts of nostalgia. They were offerings. It seemed that the street, in its quiet way, had taught them that time didn't have to be linear to be meaningful. That memory wasn't something left behind, but something we carried. Carefully, unknowingly, like lint on the shoulder of a favorite coat. And when people finally noticed how their routines had changed, they didn't try to go back. They leaned in. Some kept journals, not of what happened, but of what they remembered. One man wrote only in smells, another in shadows. A woman drew maps of places she never visited, convinced they lived inside her anyway. These weren't attempts to capture the past. They were attempts to greet it, to sit beside it without asking anything more. And in doing so, the air grew lighter, not in weight, but in intention. The silence that had once held so many unfinished stories began to hum with gentleness, like the pause before a hug, like the moment someone says, "I understand," and truly means it. Children began drawing things that no one taught them. Old radios, long-gone bus stops, rooms that had been remodeled years before they were born. When asked, they would only shrug and say, "I saw it in a dream." But their dreams began to match. Across different homes, the same staircase, the same red coat hanging by the door, the same song drifting from an unseen piano. It was as if the memories were no longer private, as if the lane itself was gently stitching them together into one shared tapestry. No one feared this. On the contrary, it felt like healing. Like pieces long scattered were returning to where they belonged. The children, unaware of the depth of what they carried, simply laughed more, ran slower, sat longer in their play, and the adults, watching them, began to do the same. One man set a table for 5, though he lived alone. A woman left the radio on all day, tuned to static because the silence now seemed too thin. A girl tied ribbons to her tree and whispered names to them, not names of friends, but of feelings. "This one is for when I missed you. This one is for when I didn't say it." And the ribbons danced, even when the air was still. At the close of the season, something unremarkable happened, and yet it changed everything. A curtain, long unmoved in the house across from the lamppost, was drawn open just enough for someone to see inside. And what they saw wasn't strange at all. Just a table, a teacup, a chair pulled out slightly like someone had left for a moment and would be back any second. But that glimpse was enough. It spread through the neighborhood like soft thunder, not in panic, in reverence. People began opening things. Windows, drawers, notebooks, arms. They shared meals on porches, left books on benches with pages marked, hung photographs from clotheslines as if airing out the truth. And the lane responded with blooming, late roses, early crocuses, trees blossoming where no seeds had been sown. The street was no longer looping through yesterday. It was listening to today, remembering it in real time. There was, in the middle of the street, not marked, not paved, a faint circle in the asphalt, not a crack, not a stain, just a slight change in tone, like the imprint of something that had once rested there for a long, long time. It had no known origin, no apparent purpose. Most walked over it without noticing. But those who did notice found themselves pausing, even if only for a second, as though their bodies knew something they didn't. Children sometimes used it as the starting point for their games, spinning in the center before darting off in all directions. Elderly neighbors, when passing by, would often shift their gaze or step slightly aside, as if out of courtesy. No one ever stood directly on it for long. The circle wasn't threatening. It was simply concentrated, like memory pooled in a shape too quiet to name. One woman, recently moved in, knelt beside it one morning. She traced its edge with her finger, curious, absent-minded. That night, she dreamed of a wedding that wasn't hers. A late afternoon ceremony under sycamores, laughter that lingered in the folds of the dress, the smell of lemon and sugar on the wind. She awoke with tears in her eyes, and the sensation of having said goodbye to someone she had never met. She never touched the circle again. After that, the street seemed to acknowledge the space more openly. Leaves avoided landing on it. Rain danced around it, never pooling. On certain days, light would hit it just right, casting a soft golden ring, like the hour hand of a sundial caught in a moment it didn't want to pass. It became less a curiosity and more a punctuation, the soft period at the end of each walk. Some began leaving things there. Not flowers, not stones, but small memories. A photograph without a face. A button from a coat no longer owned. A ticket stub from a film no longer showing. None of these offerings were removed. They simply faded gently, as though absorbed into the circle itself. The street did not forget them. It took them in, folded them into its rhythm, and hummed a little louder in their presence. No one spoke of what the circle meant, but over time, everyone accepted that it was not a mark of something lost, but something remembered exactly. There was an attic in one of the older houses, long sealed but never forgotten. The door to it had been painted over so many times that it had become part of the wall, a mere outline behind coats of beige and pale blue. The current tenant, an old man with a cane and a fondness for silence, didn't know it was there until the wind knocked something loose. Not in the roof, but in him. A feeling. A pull. The kind of urge that doesn't come with sound or logic, just a sense that something above had waited long enough. When he finally found the seam and pried it open, dust did not rise. There were no creaks, no cobwebs, only stillness, and within that stillness, a room that had not changed in decades. A narrow bed with folded linens, a small writing desk, a painting that leaned against the wall instead of hanging on it, and beside the window, a music box, wound, waiting. He did not step inside at first. He simply stood at the threshold, holding his breath the way one might in a chapel or a childhood bedroom revisited after many years. The light through the single pane of glass was soft, golden, almost watery, as though filtered through memory itself. When he did cross the threshold, the floor didn't protest. It accepted him, quietly, like a page turned gently to avoid tearing. He didn't touch much. He didn't need to. Everything in the room had already done its job. Remembering. The quilt, slightly frayed at the corners, still held the shape of knees bent in prayer. The desk, with its single drawer left ajar, held a dried petal, perfectly preserved. He opened the music box. It played the same song he used to hum as a boy, though he had no recollection of learning it. That night, he didn't sleep in his bedroom. He climbed the stairs again, slowly, reverently, and sat by the attic window until dawn. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just sat, as though returning to a conversation paused mid-sentence, finally ready to hear the rest. When the sun rose, it passed through the glass and scattered across the floor like spilled honey. He whispered a name, softly, to no one, and for a moment the room felt warmer. The attic was never sealed again. It remained open from then on, not as a secret exposed, but as a memory welcomed. And soon others began finding rooms like it, not always above, sometimes below. A linen closet that smelled like old perfume. A pantry that hummed when the door was left ajar. Spaces within spaces that had waited quietly for their chance to be remembered. There came a night when the street felt unusually awake. Not noisy, not restless, just awake. Lights blinked on and off at odd intervals, as if syncing to a rhythm no one could hear. Curtains fluttered even without wind. The lamplight took on a subtle warmth, tinged not with yellow or orange, but something closer to memory. A color the eye couldn't name, but the heart immediately recognized. On that night, the clocks stopped, every one of them. From grandfather clocks to bedside alarms to wristwatches wound out of habit, all froze at the same moment, 2:17 a.m. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was attentive, like the pause in a conversation when someone is about to say something that changes everything. And for reasons no one could explain, no one felt fear. Only a strange reverence, like standing in a room where someone had just left, their presence still echoing in the dust. People woke without alarms. They rose without reason. They stepped onto their porches in robes and sweaters, barefoot, blinking. Some carried candles. Others brought nothing but breath. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Across Rosewood Lane, they gathered in the stillness, eyes turned toward nothing in particular, only each other. It felt like a reunion, though no invitations had been sent, and no names were called. At the center of the street, someone had placed a chair. No one saw who did it. It was just there, wooden, worn, facing upward as if waiting for someone to sit and look at the stars. No one sat. They simply stood around it, shoulder to shoulder, old and young, certain and uncertain, all caught in the same still moment, all blinking at the same time. And then, from the empty chair, a sound, not a voice, not music, just the soft intake of breath. A beginning. It passed through them like a breeze through branches. It moved with familiarity, like the scent of a room you haven't entered in years, like the sound of your name said with love. They felt it before they heard it, and heard it long after it passed. Something had returned, or awakened, or simply reminded them that it had never left. When the clocks resumed, quietly, dutifully, the hands moved as if nothing had happened. But every person who had stood in that circle knew something had. They just didn't know what to call it, and so they didn't call it anything. They just carried it with them, gently, into the next morning. After that night, something about the air on Rosewood Lane became softer, not in temperature, but in texture. Breathing felt easier, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight that clung to every inhale for years had lightened. People went about their mornings a little slower, not from fatigue, but from a kind of careful reverence, as if they had woken up inside something sacred. Even the birds seemed to sing with more restraint, as if they too remembered what had happened, even if they didn't understand it. The chair remained for 3 days. No one moved it. No one sat. It stood quietly at the center of the street, never casting the same shadow twice. On the 3rd morning, just before dawn, it was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced. Gone the way a memory leaves you, not abruptly but gradually, until you suddenly realize it's no longer there. Where it had been, a single feather remained, resting against the edge of the faded asphalt circle. No one touched it, but everyone saw it. A boy pointed, and his mother nodded. That was enough. After the chair vanished, the houses seemed to exhale. Windows opened wider. Doors stayed ajar longer. Wind chimes returned to randomness. The rhythm of ordinary life resumed, but never quite the way it had been before. Something had shifted, not broken, not repaired, but softened. There was a gentleness in how neighbors greeted one another, how footsteps slowed at corners, how silence was shared without apology. People began making eye contact longer, smiling without needing to explain why. And then came the letters, again. But these were different. They didn't arrive in envelopes. They simply appeared, tucked inside recipe books, scribbled in the margins of old calendars, written in pencil on the backs of wallpaper samples or shopping lists. Some were just a line or two. It was never your fault. You were loved, even then. The goodbye wasn't the end. Others were longer, entire paragraphs that read like the final pages of stories no one realized had been left unfinished. But none of them were signed, and none of them came with dates. People didn't ask who wrote them. They just folded them carefully and placed them somewhere safe, the way you would place a photograph of someone who still visits you in dreams. No one talked about the letters out loud, but every now and then someone would pause mid-step, reach into their pocket or drawer or coat lining, and glance at a worn piece of paper with a look that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite peace either. It was something in between, and that, more than anything, was what Rosewood Lane offered. Not answers, not closure, but the stillness that allows something unnamed to finally be held. It wasn't long after the letters appeared that people began to clean out their basements. Not for spring, not for guests, but because something inside them quietly insisted, it's time. They moved boxes they hadn't opened in decades, peeled away tape yellowed with age, and touched objects they had once sworn they would never part with. It was not about throwing things away. It was about witnessing them again. A scarf still scented faintly with someone's cologne. A stack of VHS tapes labeled in handwriting you forgot you knew. A dried bouquet pressed between pages of a cookbook you never followed but couldn't bring yourself to give away. Some found journals, not written in their own hand, but familiar all the same. Others uncovered music cassettes without labels, played them, and heard lullabies no radio had ever broadcast. A few found items that shouldn't have existed at all. A ticket stub from a movie that hadn't been made. A letter from someone who'd passed, dated years beyond the present. No one panicked. The street had trained them to greet the impossible with gentleness. What once would have felt surreal now simply felt right. And it wasn't just in basements. Closets shifted too. Drawers that had stuck for years slid open effortlessly. Sweaters worn during one defining conversation reappeared at the top of the pile. A pair of shoes, long given up on, fit again, as if memory had reshaped the foot. In the corner of one home, a dusty mirror reflected not the room, but the exact afternoon when two people first forgave each other. When the woman who found it blinked, the image vanished, but the weight of that long-ago moment settled quietly in her chest, like a returning bird. Soon, a new rhythm returned to the street. People began walking slower, not in fatigue, but in deliberate observation. They paused longer before knocking on doors. They lingered after conversations ended. They waved with both hands, and inside their homes, more and more lights were left on overnight, not out of forgetfulness, but as if offering the past a warm place to sit, just in case it decided to stop by for tea. It was during this quiet shift that a painting appeared on the side of the old bakery wall, a mural that hadn't been there the day before. No one saw who painted it, but there it was. A long table, stretching into a horizon of warm golds and quiet blues, set for a meal not yet begun. The chairs were mismatched, the plates were empty, but every seat had a name card, each blank. And hovering above the scene, almost too faint to see, were outlines of hands reaching toward one another, almost touching. Children gathered first. They stood silently before the wall, holding hands without being told to. Then came the elders, who tilted their heads as if hearing a distant melody. The mural didn't move, didn't change, but the light across its surface shifted throughout the day in a way that seemed aware. In the morning it glowed with soft hope. At dusk it shimmered like longing, and under the moon it almost disappeared entirely, as if reminding everyone that some invitations exist only in memory. People began leaving things beneath it, not as offerings, more as acknowledgments, a key without a lock, a pressed flower, a note with just a name. Over time, these items were quietly collected by someone, or something. No one claimed to take them. But no matter how many were left, the wall never cluttered. It only seemed to deepen, as if absorbing the weight of being remembered and returning it as light. On the sixth evening, someone placed a chair beneath the mural and sat. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But as the last of the sunlight stretched across the table in the painting, the person smiled. Not at the wall, but at the empty air beside them, as if someone had just arrived. Others joined soon after. No ceremony, no words, just chairs, just presence, just quiet. And from that night on, the mural was no longer just a painting. It was a place. There came a time when the street no longer needed clocks. People still wore watches, still marked calendars out of habit, but time itself had become something quieter. Less about measuring, more about noticing. Mornings arrived not with alarms, but with the sound of birds that only sang when the sky turned the exact shade of soft blue between memory and dream. Nights fell not by the clock, but by the first light that flickered on in the house at the very end of the lane. Always the same one, always at the same unspoken hour. It was during this stretch of unmeasured time that people began seeing reflections of themselves in unusual places, not mirrors, not windows, but in the gloss of a puddle, in the curve of a doorknob, in the shine of a photograph left too long in the sun. And these reflections didn't always match the present. Sometimes they were younger. a flash of a child's face with familiar eyes, sometimes older, a softened version of the self, wearing forgiveness like a shawl. Sometimes they were simply different in ways no one could articulate, but deeply recognized. One woman, sweeping her porch, looked up to see herself in the silver rim of her teacup, laughing. She hadn't laughed in weeks. A man caught a glimpse of his own back as he passed the bakery window, hunched the way his father used to walk. A child saw her own reflection reaching for something. Not candy, not toys, but the hand of someone she'd only met in a dream. These moments were not frightening. They were grounding. Like the street was holding up a mirror not to show you how you looked, but how you had lived. Gradually, people began to talk less about what time it was, and more about what kind of light filled the room. Mornings became defined by whether the air smelled like lilac or dust. Evenings by the creak of the old swing behind house number 9. They marked days by whether the music box in the attic played, or whether the bench near the snow bush felt warm when they sat down. And no one minded this change, because here, presence mattered more than precision. The way you held a moment was more important than what hour it belonged to. And so, Rosewood Lane moved forward, not in steps, but in breaths. Not in dates, but in feelings. Each house continued to remember. Each porch continued to wait. And the street itself began to feel less like a place and more like a conversation. One still unfolding. One you never quite finish. One where every silence means you're still listening. On one soft, overcast morning, someone found a book lying on the bench near the snow bush. It wasn't weathered or soaked by dew. It looked as though it had just been placed there moments earlier. The cover was plain, bound in linen the color of faded sunlight, with no title, no author, no markings of any kind. Its pages were thick and creamy, and each one contained a single sentence. No two sentences were the same. No two people who read from it ever remembered the same lines. The first person to open it read, "You were forgiven before you even asked." The next found, "You left the light on, and someone made it home because of that." A child read a page that simply said, "Yes." None of them spoke of what they read immediately. They just sat in silence for a moment longer than they usually would, the way one sits beside a sleeping loved one, not to disturb, only to be near. Over time, more people came across the book. It never remained in the same place. One day, it rested in the branches of the sycamore tree. Another, it appeared tucked behind a jar in the bakery window, as though it had wandered there looking for warmth. No one ever saw it move, but somehow it always found those who needed it most. Not because they were hurting, but because they were ready. Ready to remember, to release, or to rest. The pages were not chronological. There was no table of contents, no progression, but there was a feeling of story within it. Not a plot, but a thread. The sentences stitched themselves into your memory like seams long missing from a favorite coat. People began speaking about the book, not with awe, but with familiarity, as if it had always existed and they had merely forgotten where they last saw it. Some began writing their own sentences, tucking them into the binding or slipping them beneath the cover when the book appeared. These too changed. Words rearranged themselves when read by different hands. A note that once said, "I miss you terribly," might become, "You were never truly gone," by the time it reached someone else. The book did not capture truth. It echoed memory, not as it was, but as it had been carried. And so, the book became not an artifact, but a companion. Not something to be owned, but to be found, again and again, whenever the street decided it was time. It held no wisdom it hadn't gathered from those who passed through. But what it offered was something even rarer than knowledge, the feeling of being gently, wordlessly understood. There was an evening when the air turned silver, not gray, not cold, silver, like moonlight mixed with breath. The entire lane shimmered, not with light, but with a softness that made everything look slightly blurred at the edges. It wasn't fog, it wasn't mist. It was something finer than either, like the space between thoughts, briefly made visible. People stepped outside without knowing why. They didn't speak, didn't point, didn't take photographs. They simply stood, as though witnessing the street remember itself in real time. During this silver hour, as it came to be known, certain objects began to glow faintly. A pair of shoes resting on a porch, a teacup beside a window, a photo frame tilted just enough to catch a glint of invisible sun. These were not dramatic illuminations, just the soft pulse of significance, reminders that these things, once touched by love or sorrow, now held a kind of resonance that outlived the moment that made them matter. A boy followed one of these glimmers into his grandmother's attic. He'd never been allowed up there before. This time the door creaked open as if waiting. Inside, he found not cobwebs or trunks, but a single record player. It spun without electricity, playing a tune that neither he nor his grandmother had ever heard, but both somehow recognized. They sat on the floor without speaking, listening until the record ended, though no one ever saw a needle or a switch. When they came downstairs, the grandmother opened a cupboard she hadn't opened in years and found a tin of letters, her own handwriting, addressed to no one. Elsewhere on the lane, a man touched the doorknob of his garage and remembered his father's hand on his shoulder during his first heartbreak. Not a word spoken, just the weight of being witnessed. And in that moment, he forgave things he didn't know he had been holding. A woman sitting on her porch swing heard the creak of it align with the rhythm of her mother's knitting needles, a sound she hadn't heard since she was 12. She closed her eyes and smiled, not because she missed her, but because, just for that moment, she didn't have to. The silver hour did not last long. By the time the moon had fully risen, the shimmer had softened into the ordinary again. But the people of Rosewood Lane moved differently after. Not slower, but steadier. Not looking back, but carrying what they'd seen with the kind of care reserved for breakable things, or things that had finally, after a long journey, been pieced back together. Some mornings, without announcement, the street would echo with the faint clink of cutlery, not from kitchens but from somewhere older. People stepping out to collect the paper would pause, tilting their heads toward the sound of breakfast being served long ago. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fully there. Just a suggestion of plates, of voices low with routine affection, of chairs scooting gently against wood. It came and went, like a remembered habit the mind hadn't recalled in years, but the body never forgot. These mornings were the softest. People left their doors open a little longer, took their coffee on the porch, and allowed themselves the luxury of sitting without an agenda. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full of the quiet rhythm of lives once lived, now stitched into the fabric of every fence post, every brick, every uneven tile on a walkway no longer swept as often as it used to be. And in that fullness, people began to revisit, not what they had done, but who they had been. One man walked the path behind his home and found an old rope swing hanging from a branch. It hadn't been there in decades. He stood before it, unsure whether to smile or grieve. In the end, he touched it lightly and whispered something into the bark of the tree. Not a name, not a prayer, just a sound he hadn't made since he was 10. A woman found her mother's handwriting on the inside of a recipe card, though her mother had passed long before she learned to cook. And somehow, that simple loop of ink felt more comforting than any dish ever could. Children began gathering near the mural again, but this time not to look, to draw. Chalk appeared without origin, pale blues, warm pinks, golden whites. They traced outlines of hands, tables, windows. Not perfect, not planned, just whatever their fingers remembered before their minds did. One boy drew a dog no one had seen in years, and 3 neighbors recognized it without needing to speak. The act of remembering had become communal now, stitched across generations like the passing of a quiet melody on a slow breeze. The street didn't demand anything. It didn't pull or push. It simply continued to hold space for those who stayed, for those who left, and for those still unsure which they were. One night, near the edge of the season, the wind carried a scent that stopped everyone mid-thought. It was not strong. It was not familiar. But it was deeply, impossibly personal, different for each person, yet somehow shared. To one, it smelled like a winter scarf left in an old drawer. To another, the warm engine of a car driven on summer nights. To someone else, the breath of a letter opened too late. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something deeper, something cellular. Lights stayed off that night. People sat by windows, letting the dark in without resistance. A few lit candles, not for illumination, but as markers, as if saying, I was here. I'm still here. In one home, an elderly woman folded linens with extraordinary care, smoothing each one with both hands before setting it down. In another, a man who hadn't played piano in decades placed his fingers on keys and let them rest, not to make music, but to feel the weight of sound unspoken. Outside, the trees did not move, but their shadows did, gently, like memories shifting in sleep. The bench near the snow bush, long the keeper of quiet observation, glowed faintly under the moonlight. A couple, now in their 90s, sat beside each other without speaking. Their hands touched only at the fingertips, yet everything between them passed without a word. Love didn't need a voice on Rosewood Lane. It had already been translated too many times. The mural shimmered slightly, but no one approached. The street was not asking for attention. It was simply existing, completely, holding every version of every person who had ever walked it, and those still walking it in memory only. And though nothing happened that night, everyone who lived there would later say, that was the evening I knew I belonged to something more than just a place. And then, quietly, gently, like breath leaving a room, the season ended. Not with fanfare. Not with the last leaf or the first frost. It ended the way an old story does, not because it must, but because it's ready. The house at the corner closed its windows. The music box in the attic played once more and went still. The feather that had remained in the center of the street lifted briefly with the wind, turned once in the air, and disappeared. Not upward, not downward, but inward, like a page folding into itself. People began to move with new rhythms. Not faster, not louder, but steadier. They greeted the day without reaching for clocks. They held eye contact just a little longer. Some returned to old hobbies. Others forgave old versions of themselves without saying it aloud. And while the lane no longer shimmered quite so brightly, it no longer needed to. The shimmer had moved inside them now, a glow behind the ribs, quiet and constant, like the hum of a remembered song in a still room. Children stopped looking for the book, not because it was gone, but because they had learned how to write their own pages. And sometimes, when chalk drawings appeared near the mural, they weren't made by children at all. Adults had begun to add their own soft lines, their own echoes, not as artists, but as witnesses. And the mural kept growing, not wider, not taller, but deeper, until it no longer needed paint to hold what it held. And in this way, Rosewood Lane did not return to what it was before. It became what it had always wanted to be, a place that remembers even when you forget. A loop, not a trap, but a rhythm. A street that carries you gently back to yourself. There comes a time when even memory rests, not because it fades, but because it finally feels safe enough to stop rehearsing itself. That time had arrived on Rosewood Lane. The houses no longer whispered quite as loudly. The swing behind number 9 still moved, but less from wind than from habit. Even the trees seemed to lean back into their roots, as if content to simply hold what had already been witnessed. The street was no longer waiting. It had become still, not empty, but full, like a room where a conversation had ended and no one felt the need to fill the silence. Those who had lived there the longest began doing something new. They started leaving their doors unlocked, not out of carelessness, but as a gesture, a quiet offering to presence itself. Some even left a chair outside their homes at night, not for anyone in particular, but as a kind of punctuation. Someone was here. Someone is welcome. The chairs were mismatched, some wooden, some metal, some folding. But each one held the same posture. Open. Children began asking fewer questions about the things that once made the street mysterious. They no longer pointed at the glowing bench, or the tree with the knot shaped like an eye, or the silver hour that still returned on occasion. Instead, they folded these things into their play, the way children do with rules of a game older than memory. They adapted not because they understood, but because they trusted. And so, the street became less an artifact of wonder and more a background hum of something quietly eternal. Visitors still came, though not as many as before. A cousin from out of state, a woman who once passed through as a girl. They arrived with furrowed brows and left with softened shoulders, never quite sure what had shifted, but knowing something had. One man stood at the mural for hours, then whispered into the air, "I think this is where I left myself." He did not cry. He did not explain. He simply walked away slower than he had arrived. And in the attic of house number 12, the music box spun once again. Not by wind, not by hand. It played one last note, not louder than before, but clearer, as if completing a sentence that had taken years to write. No one heard it directly, and yet everyone did. Like a bell that only rings inside the part of you that once forgot how to listen. After that, the lid of the box closed gently on its own, and the attic breathed. One morning, a thin layer of frost dusted the entire street, not from weather, but from something gentler, like the exhale of a long-held breath. It sparkled on mailbox handles, rooftops, and porch rails, but melted instantly beneath bare feet. No one had predicted cold, and yet no one complained. Children walked to school in their usual jackets, adults ran errands as they always had, and yet each person paused once, just once, in front of their own front door, as if confirming, quietly, that they had indeed returned. It wasn't a dramatic day. No letters fell from the sky. No new mural appeared. The bench remained still. The snowbush, evergreen in every season, was bare that morning, and somehow more beautiful for it. What had once been a place of remembering now simply was. No longer asking, no longer showing, just being. And in that shift, the people followed suit. A woman who had once needed the street to remember for her now began planting tulips again. She no longer checked for signs or echoes. She simply trusted that if something was meant to return, it would, quietly, in its own time. A man who had waited each afternoon by the corner mailbox stopped waiting, not because he had given up hope, but because he finally carried that hope inside him. And a young boy, who had never known life outside the loop of this lane, took a different path home from school. Not because he was lost, but because he was ready to see what else the world remembered. Inside the houses, people began to clear space, not out of grief, not from closure, but as a kind of respectful preparation. A drawer once filled with unsent letters now held fresh paper. A shelf that had held dusty photos now cradled a vase of nothing, just light. And in each home, a quiet was taking shape. Not emptiness, not absence, but the kind of quiet that comes when you realize nothing more needs to be said. At dusk, the street lit itself, not all at once, but in waves. One window, then another. Then the porch light at number 7 always last, flickering on like a sigh. And for the first time in a long time, the air didn't hum with memory or shimmer with something waiting to be known. It simply held the evening, fully, gently, completely. Later that week, someone left a note on the bench beneath the crooked lamppost. It wasn't tucked or hidden, just resting there, caught gently under a smooth stone. The paper was folded once, aged only slightly, and when opened, revealed a single sentence written in fine blue ink. "Thank you for keeping what I couldn't." No name, no date, no further explanation. Yet, as the morning sun touched the paper, those who passed by seemed to know exactly what it meant, even if they never stopped to read it. The note remained untouched for several days. The wind never carried it away. The dew never blurred its ink. Even the birds who had grown accustomed to landing near the bench avoided stepping on it. It was as if the lane itself had agreed. Some things are meant to stay visible just long enough. Then one morning, the note was gone, and in its place, not a new message, but a feather, not from the sky, but from memory itself. That day the mural looked different, not in color, not in form, but in presence. People who walked by didn't pause as they used to. They no longer searched the table for their own name, or tried to match the outlines of the hands above. They simply passed with a small nod, the kind one gives when a chapter closes not in tragedy, but in peace. The mural was no longer asking to be seen. It had become part of the neighborhood, like the ivy, the street lamp, the faint piano notes that sometimes return just before rain. Life on Rosewood Lane settled into something resembling ordinary, though no one would have described it that way. Gardens grew again, imperfectly. Paint peeled on porches without urgency. Laughter returned, not loud, but sincere. And when the silver hour drifted in on occasion, brushing trees and window panes with its delicate shimmer, people didn't chase it or try to name it. They simply lived through it, eyes softened by understanding, hands still, hearts open. Somewhere near the end of the street, in a house with ivy nearly covering the entire left side, a woman stood at her window and watched the morning unfold. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't remembering. She was simply watching. And when a gust of wind shifted the branches just enough to let in a shaft of golden light, she smiled. Not because she saw something special, but because, for once, she didn't need to. In the early hours before dawn, the street was at its most honest. No footsteps, no birds, just the soft breath of stillness brushing across windowsills and hedges, reminding everything it touched that it had always been there, even when no one noticed. On one such morning, the old sycamore near the bend creaked once, gently, as if nodding. A leaf fell, though it was spring. It landed without ceremony near the edge of the pavement, where cracks had formed long ago in the shape of a winding river. A boy walking to meet the morning bus spotted the leaf and picked it up without thinking. It was golden, impossibly so. Not yellowed, not brittle, but warm, like it had remembered the sun longer than it should. He tucked it into his pocket, unaware that it would become the first thing he packed when he left for college years later. The leaf would dry, as all things do, but its warmth would never fade. That was the way Rosewood Lane gave its gifts. Not loudly, not always immediately understood, but lasting in the ways that matter. In another house, an old man rose early and opened every window in his kitchen. He didn't light a candle or turn on the radio. He simply let the air in, and with it, the faintest scent of pears. It reminded him of a day no one else remembered, one without consequence, yet so perfectly uneventful it had become his favorite. He stood in that memory like it was a room, nodding quietly to its walls, then made himself a cup of tea and sipped it slowly, one breath at a time. Across the lane, a woman who had once tried to forget everything now spent her mornings tending to the things she had once avoided. She dusted photographs. She watered plants grown from cuttings she didn't recognize. She wrote small notes and tucked them into jacket pockets she planned to donate. Words like "you are still becoming" or "it is okay to stay soft." These gestures weren't for closure. They were for continuity. And she didn't need to know where the coats would end up. She trusted the street would take care of the rest. Outside, the breeze picked up just enough to scatter petals from the tree that always bloomed out of season. The petals spun and danced and settled without fuss, not as omens, not as symbols, just as petals. And someone walking by looked up, not because they expected anything extraordinary, but because they had finally learned that sometimes noticing was enough. That afternoon, the bench beneath the crooked lamppost stood empty. Not lonely, just quiet. It had witnessed countless moments, beginnings, regrets, reunions too subtle to be called that. But now it simply was. The wood had softened, worn smooth by years of weight, both physical and unseen. The metal arms bore the fingerprints of those who leaned without knowing they needed support. It did not creak anymore. It didn't need to. A girl passed by holding a book. Not the book, but her own. Its cover was hand-painted. Pages filled with moments not meant for plot or publication, only for remembering. She sat on the bench, opened it to the middle, and added a sentence. No one saw what she wrote. No one needed to. When she closed the book, she looked up at the street around her. Not seeking magic, not listening for music, only sitting inside the quiet hum of something that no longer needed to prove itself. She left the book beside her and walked away, and the bench welcomed it like a final line returned to its page. A breeze picked up near the mural, lifting corners of paper that had been pinned to a wooden board nearby, small notes that had gathered over the seasons, messages too brief to keep and too tender to throw away. Some were now unreadable, words smudged into watercolor. Others still held their form. I remember the sound of your shoes. You mattered. It wasn't too late. No one curated them. No one removed them. They lived and faded like echoes across stone. That evening, as the sky deepened into the purples that always seemed reserved for endings, someone placed a lantern at the edge of the lane. A simple glass vessel with a flickering flame. It wasn't for guidance. It wasn't for memory. It was simply a presence, glowing in the hush of the coming dark. A few stopped and nodded. One touched it gently. And then, like all things on Rosewood Lane, it stayed, without asking why, without needing to be moved. And so, the loop remained. Not as a trap, not as a ghost, but as a rhythm. A rhythm that knew when to hold, when to release, and when to simply listen. The street no longer shimmered with wonder. It had settled into something even rarer, belonging. It became the kind of place you didn't need to explain, a place that didn't need to prove it was different. It only needed to exist quietly for those who had learned how to see it. Children grew up. Some moved away. Some didn't. But none truly left. Because to have lived on Rosewood Lane, even briefly, was to carry its breath in your lungs, its silence between your thoughts, its curve in the way you walked toward what mattered. Those who stayed planted new hedges, painted shutters, new colors. But the feeling never changed. It waited at every doorstep, in the moment before sleep, in the pause before a hello, in the weight of an old coat pulled from the closet one more time. People stopped talking about what the street could do. They began talking about what it allowed them to feel, to forgive, to sit with the ache instead of fixing it, allowed them to look backward without getting stuck, and forward without fear, allowed them to simply be as they were, surrounded by memory, not defined by it. One last leaf fell from the old sycamore, drifting downward like a closing breath. It landed softly in the center of the street, the faded circle that had once held so many unnamed things. No one picked it up. No one needed to. It rested exactly where it should, in a place that no longer needed signs or symbols, only space. And if you were to walk down Rosewood Lane today, on foot, in memory, or in dream, you might not notice anything strange at all. Just houses, just trees, just light. But something in you would shift, slightly, gently, as if reminded that even time, when loved enough, can learn how to wait.